The morning my son told me I didn't need to come until an hour before the ceremony, I was standing in the back kitchen of Sweet Mercy Baking Co., with flowers still on my apron and a 5-tier wedding cake sitting in the center of the work table. I had spent 3 days on that cake, 3 days of almond sponge, fresh raspberry filling, and hand-piped white roses that I had practiced a dozen times before getting right. My hands were still sore from the piping bag. It wasn't even my son who called, it was Whitney. "Miss Shirley," she said. She had always called me Miss Shirley, never Mom, though the wedding was 6 weeks away. The morning schedule is really packed. With hair and makeup running long, it might just be easier if you came a little later. Maybe an hour before the ceremony starts? An hour before the ceremony meant I would walk in with the guests. "Of course," I said, "whatever works best." I hung up and stood very still in the kitchen for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. The street outside was quiet. And I looked at the invoice folder on my desk, the one labeled Leon and Whitney, wedding payments, and thought about all the times my name and my credit card number had appeared at the bottom of a document over the past 8 months. I thought about that, and then I thought about the fact that my son had not called me himself. I want to tell you who I am before I tell you what happened next, because this story doesn't make sense without that part first. My name is Shirley Watkins. I am 62 years old, and I have run a bakery called Sweet Mercy Baking Co. on Forsyth Road in Macon, Georgia for 28 years. My husband Roy and I opened it together this spring after our son was born. Roy handled the numbers and the suppliers and the early morning deliveries. I handled the kitchen. The name was Roy's idea. He said Sweet Mercy was the feeling you got when something tasted better than you expected. He had a way of saying simple things that turned out to be exactly right. Leon grew up in that back kitchen. He sat on a folding chair beside the work table from the time he could hold himself upright. By age 7, he could frost a sheet cake well enough that customers complimented it without knowing a child had done it. By 12, he had strong opinions about whether a lemon tart needed more zest. He used to walk out into the shop on Saturday mornings and announce the day's specials to whoever was standing at the counter, like a little mayor of the pastry case. Customers loved him. They'd say, "That boy is going to run this place someday." Leon always shook his head. "Nope," he'd say, grinning. "I'm going to work in finance and buy Mom a bigger oven." He kept half that promise. He went to Georgia State, earned a finance degree, landed a position at a firm in Atlanta. I was proud of him in the way parents of first-generation college graduates understand. A pride that lives in your chest and doesn't have a proper name for itself. I lost Roy 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by September. The speed of it still doesn't feel real when I think about it. One day he was taste testing the new cinnamon roll recipe, and 3 days later he was in the hospital, and 7 months after that he was gone. I thought about closing the bakery after the funeral. Every morning for about 3 months, I stood at the front door with my keys in my hand and considered it seriously. But every time I stepped into the back kitchen, I felt Roy somewhere near me in the smell of warm butter and vanilla, and I stayed. I kept baking. I took on more custom cake orders than I probably should have. I did it partly because I needed the routine, and partly because Leon had, as always, said he wanted me to make his wedding cake when that day came. He said it the last Christmas before Roy passed. We were decorating a Yule log cake together at the kitchen table, Leon laughing at my attempt to shape a mushroom out of marzipan. He looked up and said, very seriously for a 26-year-old, "Mom, when I get married, I want you to make the cake, not some hotel bakery." I told him I would. I meant it the way you mean the things that matter most. Leon met Whitney Caldecott about 18 months after Roy died. He called me the night of their 3rd date, and I could hear it in his voice immediately. That quality someone has when they're trying not to sound too certain about something they're already completely certain about. She worked in interior design in Charleston, specializing in high-end residential projects. Her family had money, old South Carolina money, the kind that comes with a last name that opens doors and a property near the water. Her father, Alton Caldecott, ran a real estate development company. Her mother, Francine, organized charity galas, sat on several nonprofit boards, and had what Leon described as very particular taste in everything. I met Whitney 6 months into the relationship at a brunch Leon hosted at his apartment in Atlanta. She was warm in a precise way, attentive to the right details, never missing a conversational cue. She noticed the coffee cake I brought before I mentioned I had made it and asked what flour I used for the crumb. I liked her for that. I met Francine Caldecott a few months later at dinner at a restaurant in Charleston that cost more per plate than I charged for a full custom wedding cake. She was immaculate in the way of women who have maintained an image for decades. Small pearl earrings, a linen jacket pressed without a single crease, a handshake that communicated confidence rather than warmth. "Leon tells us your bakery is quite the Macon institution," she said during the appetizers. I told her we had been on Forsyth Road for nearly 30 years. She smiled pleasantly. A real family enterprise. Something about how she said the word family made the sentence land smaller than it sounded. I told myself I was imagining it. Parents are good at talking themselves out of the small moments that feel slightly off. When Leon called me 8 months later to say he had proposed, he was still breathless. He asked if I had my calendar nearby. I said yes. He said, "Start thinking about the cake." I smiled so hard my face hurt. What followed over the next several months was a slow and quiet education in what it felt like to be needed for your money and invisible for everything else. I was not invited to the venue tour. Leon mentioned it after the fact. He and Whitney had gone with her parents on a weekend I was, apparently, assumed to be unavailable. No one had checked whether I was available. I was available. I had waited that entire weekend in case someone called. I was not included when they finalized the ceremony music, the floral arrangements, or the reception layout. I was not asked to the cake tasting at a hotel ballroom in Columbia that Whitney and Francine had arranged with another vendor. I learned about this tasting from a casual comment Leon made on the phone a week after it happened, when he mentioned the flavors were still being finalized. I did not point out that I had flavors of my own that were very much finalized. I told myself there would be time to sort it out. But every time a payment came due, the call came to me. "Mom, the venue needs the initial deposit. Mom, the catering advance has to go out this week. Mom, the rehearsal dinner space won't hold the date without a signed contract." I transferred the funds each time. Leon said he would pay me back after his year-end bonus. I told him not to worry about it. The first time I attended an actual planning meeting was 3 months before the wedding at the Caldecott family home outside Charleston. I drove down the night before and stayed at a hotel on Meeting Street because there had been no mention of staying at the house. The estate was everything you might expect. A double piazza with ceiling fans turning slowly overhead, hardwood floors that creaked in the way floors do when they have been there for a century, a back garden that led down toward a private dock. It was beautiful in a way that made me aware of my sensible shoes and my cardigan. A wedding coordinator named Petra had laid the planning materials across a long sunroom table. Francine walked us through each section with practiced efficiency. Alton moved in and out quietly, asking careful questions, carrying a glass of iced tea. When Petra turned to me and asked about the cake, I began to describe what I had designed. A 5-tier almond sponge, fresh raspberry filling, hand-piped white roses, gold leaf at the base of each tier. I had sketches ready. I had samples I could bring. Francine interrupted gently. "That sounds lovely, Shirley. We've also been in touch with a chocolatier in Columbia that Petra recommended, just as a secondary option to have in mind." She said it lightly, the way you mention something inconsequential. But no one had told me there was a secondary option. No one had suggested my cake might be a first option that needed a backup. Whitney shifted in her chair and moved on to the next agenda item quickly. I sat quietly for the rest of the meeting and smiled when it seemed appropriate. On the drive back to my hotel, I rolled the windows down, even though the October air was cold, and let the night in. The invoices told me the truth 7 weeks before the wedding. I was doing my regular bookkeeping on a Tuesday afternoon when I pulled out the wedding payment folder and spread everything across the desk. I had not added up the total until that moment. When I did, the number was significantly larger than I had been tracking mentally, and in the middle of the stack I found an invoice I did not recognize. The company was called Caldecott Event Partners. The description read Venue Logistics Coordination Services. The amount was $14,800, paid 6 weeks earlier. My credit card number sat at the bottom. I had never heard of Caldecott Event Partners. I knew every vendor on this wedding. I called my friend Glenda, who had been a CPA for 30 years and had done my business taxes since the bakery opened. She arrived 40 minutes later with her laptop and didn't say much while she worked. She just went through the invoices the way she goes through all numbers, quietly, without expression. We found 3 payments to the same company. Total, $37,400. That's not a coordination fee, Glenda said. She typed for a moment and turned the screen toward me, a South Carolina business registration page. Caldecott Event Partners. Registered owner, Reed Caldecott. Whitney's older brother. Glenda clicked to another screen, an article from a Charleston business publication from 14 months earlier. Financial trouble. Investor disputes. Reed's name throughout. She turned the laptop once more. At the bottom of one of the invoices, a digital payment authorization. Customer signature, Leon A. Watkins. My son had approved the transfers. I didn't drive to Atlanta that same evening. I sat in the bakery after Glenda left and let myself be still. I wasn't ready to call it anger. It felt more like something heavy, settling into a space where I had been pretending there was nothing to worry about. I drove to Leon's apartment the next morning. He opened the door and looked at me the way people look at something they have been hoping would stay in a drawer. We sat at his kitchen table. I put the folder in front of him and asked him about Caldecott Event Partners. He was quiet for a long time, then he told me. Leon had told Whitney's family, in the early months of their relationship, that Sweet Mercy was more than a single-location neighborhood bakery. He had described it as a multi-location catering enterprise with regional contracts and family capital behind it. He had let Francine believe his family had financial standing similar to theirs. He had let Whitney believe it too, at least in the beginning. Why, I said, not a question, a word I needed to say out loud. He rubbed the back of his neck. Because the first time I went to their house in Charleston, I understood what world they lived in. And I was afraid that if they knew the real version, they'd see me differently. Or Whitney would. I thought about Francine saying family enterprise with that particular emphasis. And the money to read, I said. He exhaled slowly. Francine came to me about 4 months ago. She said Reed was going through a difficult financial period and needed a short-term bridge loan to close out a deal. She said she knew I had access to the wedding fund payments and she wanted to help her son without involving Alton. She said it would only be temporary, that once Reed's deal closed, he would return everything before anyone noticed. And you agreed. I thought I could fix it before you found out. The deal didn't close. No. I folded my hands on the table. And Whitney called me the night before the ceremony to tell me not to come in the morning. Leon looked down at the table. Was that Francine's idea too? He nodded, once, very slowly. She was worried that if you were around during the morning preparations, you might ask questions about vendors, or say something to Alton that would make the numbers add up wrong. She suggested to Whitney that you weren't needed for that part. The last piece fell into place. My son had not kept me away from his wedding because he was ashamed of me. He had kept me away because I was the one person who could accidentally expose the entire structure he had built. I sat with that for a moment. It hurt differently than shame would have. In some ways, it hurt more. The morning of the wedding was gray and cool, the kind of October day that feels like the season arriving in earnest. I loaded the cake into the van myself. All 5 tiers in their individual boxes, the way I had packed wedding cakes for 28 years. My hands knew the work even when my mind was somewhere else. Leon had called me 2 nights after our conversation. He said he was going to tell Whitney everything before the ceremony. He said he was done carrying it. I didn't ask whether he was certain. I told him I would be there regardless. The estate outside Charleston was exactly as I remembered from the planning meeting. Live oak trees, Spanish moss, white columns, the back garden sloping down toward quiet water. I carried the cake tiers inside and set them up in the reception space while the morning preparations moved around me. When the last tier was in place, the coordinator, Petra, stepped back and looked at it. "That is the most beautiful wedding cake I have ever placed in this room," she said. I thanked her and went on smoothing the gold leaf. I was finishing the base detail when I heard voices on the other side of the reception tent. Not shouting, but the tight, careful kind of intensity people use when they're trying to argue without making a scene. I walked to the edge of the tent and saw Alton standing near the garden path, speaking to Reed in a low voice that carried further than he intended. "The coordinator just showed me a payment breakdown that doesn't match what I was told," Alton was saying. "Whose account received those funds, Reed?" I stepped back inside. 20 minutes later, Whitney found me beside the cake table. She was still in her robe, her hair half-pinned, her eyes carrying the careful composure of someone who had very recently been crying and was holding herself together with intention. She said Leon was in the library with her father. She said Reed had said something before he could stop himself. She said everything was happening at once. "Did you know," she asked me, "about the money going to Reed?" "I found out after the fact," I said. She held my eyes for a moment. "I didn't know. Francine came to Leon without telling me. I only found out last night when Leon told me everything." She said it plainly, not defensively. I believed her. She was a woman who had also been standing outside of something, just from a different direction. We stood together for a few minutes without talking. The cake sat behind us, every tier precisely in place. When Leon came out of the library, his face was very still. Alton walked beside him, the expression of a man who has heard something he wasn't prepared to hear and is deciding how to hold it. Leon found Whitney immediately. I watched from across the room as he spoke to her. Not looking away, not managing his expression, just talking. I watched her face move through several things, and then I watched her nod. The ceremony did not happen that afternoon. The guests were told there was a delay. Some of them understood from the way the staff had stopped moving with purpose. Francine remained inside the house and did not come out for a long time. Reed left before the hour was out. Alton came to find me near the cake table after things had settled. He was a quiet man who chose his words carefully. He thanked me for what I had contributed. He said it in a way that made clear he now understood how much that contribution had actually been. "Your son is a good man," he said. "He did a foolish thing, and when it came to it, he told the truth about it himself. That matters." I nodded. I didn't have anything to add to that, because he was right. Leon and Whitney called off the ceremony that afternoon. Not the relationship. Just that particular Saturday. Leon told me later that Whitney said she needed time to know who he actually was when he stopped trying to fit himself into a shape he thought she required. He said she asked him to show her the real version. He said that sounded fair. I drove back to Macon that evening with the empty cake boxes in the back of the van. The 5-tier cake stayed at the estate. Petra had suggested leaving it for the family and the staff, and I agreed because a cake that beautiful shouldn't go to waste because the plans around it changed. 3 weeks later, Leon came to the bakery on a Tuesday. He came the way he had as a teenager, unannounced, through the back, looking for something to eat. He sat on the stool by the work table and watched me pipe rosettes on a birthday order. "I've been talking to Whitney," he said. "Really talking." "About what?" "About why I thought I had to be a different version of myself for any of it to work. About what I was actually afraid of." He watched my hands for a moment. "She wants to meet you. The real version of this family. She wants to come to the bakery." I kept piping. "When?" Whenever you'll have us." I set the bag down and looked at my son, this man who had sat at this exact table when he was small enough that his feet didn't reach the floor, who had learned to measure flour by weight and tell the difference between a cake that needed more time and one that was ready, who had grown up, been afraid, made a serious mistake, and was now sitting in his mother's kitchen trying to figure out what came next. "You bring her on a Saturday," I said. "I'll teach her how to make a proper peach pound cake, Roy's recipe." Leon smiled, the first real one I had seen in months. "And Leon," I said. He looked at me. "Next time there's a wedding cake to make, you call me first, not after the deposit clears, not after the tasting, first." "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. I picked up the piping bag again. Outside on Forsyth Road, a delivery truck rumbled past. The refrigerators hummed. The bakery smelled like brown butter and cardamom and all the ordinary things that keep a life moving forward after the harder ones have passed through. Roy used to say people don't come here for perfection, they come here for heart. I had believed that for 28 years, and I believed it still. Some things you build slowly, and some things get tested, and some things hold anyway. That was the part I was counting on.